In one of the most harrowing chapters of the Death Guard's ever-tragic tale, their unrelenting and unyielding loyalty to Horus, and more darkly, their servitude to the forces beyond mortal understanding, led them to a fate which there would be no return from. That fate would see Mortarion and his warriors forever bound and corrupted. For all his disdain for witchery and his rejection of anything resembling the powers of sorcery, Mortarion would be forced and left with little recourse as his fleet, led by First Captain Callus Typhon, made a seemingly ill-fated transition into the warp. Typhon, in his manipulations and secretive dealings, had very well knowingly condemned the Death Guard to a fate of unimaginable torment and unending transformation. While Mortarion harbored no end of contempt for sorcery, he would soon learn that the tides of the Immaterium, those alien and malevolent creatures of the warp, were not easily navigated without the guiding hand of an infernal power. And so it was that Typhon steered the Death Guard fleet deeper and deeper still into the Empyrean, to the point that their destiny was irrevocably altered. By leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had deliberately delivered them into the grasps of the ruinous powers, and more specifically, into the ever-decaying embrace of Grandfather Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. Nurgle's influence was vast and all-consuming as it began to creep across the fleet. At first it was subtle, a lingering miasma that gradually clouded their ship's atmospheres, but soon it became a force darker and more potent than anything they had yet encountered. It was therefore the fleet would become trapped in the warp with no hope of escape. Directionless, the Death Guard warship languished in the eye of the unrelenting storm that was the Immaterium. It was then that the true horrors of their experience would begin. The strange and volatile nature of the Imperium is notoriously known for distorting reality, but the Death Guard had unfortunately crossed into the domain of a god whose very essence was that of rot and decay. Nurgle's rot, a terrible, virulent plague, began to take a hold upon each and every last member of the Death Guard as it seeped through metal hulls and into their very being, poisoning not just the vessels that had once carried the Legion onto glory, but spreading deeper still into the warriors themselves, who were now helpless against this insidious disease. The Destroyer Plague was a manifestation of Nurgle's infectious wrath, and it found fertile ground within the very bones of the Death Guard. Soon, no part of this fleet was left untouched. Fat, twisted flies, strange otherworldly creatures, buzzed throughout the ship's corridors. Their incessant hum was a harbinger of coming destruction. Their venomous stings sank into the flesh of the Death Guard, and where they bit, flesh began to blister, bubble, and warp. Power armor, once a proud symbol of their transhuman strength, began to melt, morph, and distort into strange new forms, fusing with the infected warriors in grotesque, abominable displays. As the infection spread, the Death Guard could neither fight nor flee. Their transhuman resilience, which had served them well in countless battles, became an unending prison as their bodies refused to die, but instead they were forced to endure eternal, agonizing transformation. The warriors of the Death Guard, once the epitome of endurance and strength, now found themselves trapped in an unending, unrelenting cycle of corruption. As their bodies twisted and deformed, they were gradually transformed and metamorphosed into the very first Plague Marines. In the end, it was not an honorable death that would claim them, but a slow, relentless process of decay that consumed them from within, as each warrior's soul was claimed by Nurgle, who offered them a cruel form of mercy, an eternal release from pain and suffering in exchange for their total subjugation to the Lord of Decay. In the wake of this transformation, Typhon, who had been the architect of the Death Guard's inevitable ruin, was rewarded as his loyalty to Nurgle was now complete, and the former first captain, the once revered and trusted commander, the right hand of Mortarion, became the favored mortal servant of the Plague God, and his reward would be a twisted form of immortality. In the wake of the catastrophic descent into the warp, the Death Guard's suffering would only deepen, culminating in their horrifying transformation that would forever alter their legion and shape the future. And one of these changes would be Callus Typhon, becoming Typhus, host of the Destroyer Hive, some of the very warp-spawned demonic beasts that were the initial infection vector of the Death Death Guard. Now as Typhus, he would serve as a chilling testament to the horrors wrought by loyalty to the craven gods. Swelling in size, Typhon's skin and armor melded into a grotesque unified mass, as bone funnels, jagged and horrific, sprouted from his body, channeling the foul energies of Nurgle into a living, writhing conduit of corruption. Into these sickening channels did the demon flies make their home, as they gnawed at him from the inside out, feeding on his ever-decaying and regenerating flesh, functionally allowing Typhon's body to become little more than a hollow vessel teeming with these demonic insects, each buzzing with disease and decay granted to them by their masters. However, this transformation was not merely physical, it was spiritual as well, a complete subjugation of the Legion to the essence and will of Nurgle. The once proud first captain had been remade as Typhus, Lord of Chaos and the hosts of the Destroyer Hive, not a being of flesh, but rather a manifestation of pestilence and decay. His new form, a nightmarish mutation, a fusion of insect and man, his body now a breeding ground for disease, as his every movement was a call of death and suffering. His bone funnels did not only serve as homes for the hive, but as a conduit for the Destroyer Plague, one of the most virulent and terrifying diseases ever to ravage the galaxy. Although the plague's vector, the demon flies, would be the choke point of its spread, it was still devastating wherever it struck, and strike it did, leaving a trail of death and suffering across the Imperium. Typhus would go on to carry and use the Destroyer Plague as his personal weapon, unleashing upon the Imperium of Man a tally of destruction unending. But the true horror was not merely the birth of Typhus, but what this meant for the Death Guard. Mortarion, once a proud primarch of unmatched, unending resilience and of an unbreakable will, was now faced with a cruel irony. His legion, built upon a foundation of their incredible endurance, found themselves powerless in the face of Nurgle's plague. Their bodies, once strong, were now rendered meaningless. The very strength that had defied them was now a pointless gesture. The pestilence would now surge through their ranks, infecting their superhuman forms, bloating them, disintegrating their flesh, and transforming them into pestilent grotesque. This was no simple disease, as it was an agonizing and ever-repeating process of corruption, decay, and rebirth. The Death Guard's warriors found themselves trapped within an endless cycle, unable to die, but forced to endure excruciating, unending agony, as the plagues roiled within them, twisting their bodies into unrecognizable and unholy abomination. Their once legendary resilience, so often their greatest strength, had become their greatest curse. The plague's effects ravaged them from the inside, each minute bringing a new flavor of suffering, as the Death Guard's warriors were faced with a fate worse than death itself, forced to watch their once proud forms disintegrate into repugnant, repulsive, and disgusting contorted shells of their former selves. No one suffered more in this transformation than Mortarion himself. His pride and his strength, once unshakable, were now made mockery by this very thing that he had sought to control, decay. Whether in the depths of his suffering, Mortarion realized the magnitude of the domination that he had brought upon himself and his legion by siding with the traitors. Whether he understood the consequences of his pact with Nurgle, only he would ever know. What is certain is in those final, harrowing, nightmarish moments, the Death Guard were forever changed. They were no longer the warriors they had once been. Rather, they were now agents of decay, a reflection of the destruction that they had brought upon themselves. The warp puckered beneath the surface of reality before detonating into existence. It was an ugly, catastrophic eruption that vomited raw madness and broken shards of tainted impossibility, opening into a festering wound on the face of space-time. The Terra, in actuality, defied the pathetic rules of what was and what could be. Freakish things that could not live outside of nightmares became solid for brief moments, the sheer force of the breach willing them into existence. Around the rippling, shrieking edges of the Terra, great coruscating tides of lethal radiation and charm-tainted particles storms the airless void into a blaze of soul-twisting pseudo-colors, and from their proclaimed prison in the depths of the Immaterium, the flotilla of the Death Guard Legion found their escape. Hundreds of rusting warhulks burst forth into the skies around the greatest bastion of the Emperor's Imperium, soiling the darkness with their very presence as the rays of faraway soul fell upon their blighted hulls. Daggers of corroding metal that had once been proud symbols of the 14th Legion poured out and wove amongst one another as carrion flies would swarm about the Hulk's bloody meat. Gargantuan battle barges came with them, slow and ponderous, trailing steams of decay and poisonous effluent. At length, when the blighted fleet had passed through the portals of its eternity, the wound in space snapped shut. Slowly the mass of non-dead matter and deceased steel that was the Death Guard reborn turned their bows towards distant Terra. That world was beheld in the eye of a gargantuan skeletal being, a towering hooded reaper, clasping a giant scythe in one clawed hand. He raised the other to point towards the glittering ember, flexing the muscles and the seething blood of his changed form in action. The order was given in silence. Lost in the dire shadows of his fathomless hood, Mortarion allowed himself to smile. When the Death Guard finally emerged from the warp, they were no longer the warriors they had once been. Their formerly gleaming ivory armor, adorned with notable jade heraldry of the Emperor's champions, was now sullied and stained with a sickly, unnatural pallor of greenish hues. The once proud forms, known for their resilience, had swollen to grotesquely inhuman shape. Every warrior had been transformed into something far worse than the previous. Their bodies, bloated and diseased, were pockmarked with boils, scabs, and rotting sores. The air itself around them was thick with a stench of corruption, as maggots crawled in their open, unhealing wounds, and black flies buzzed about them, carrying the taint of their plague-ridden state all about them. Their weapons, once finely crafted instruments of war, were now warped by the taint of Nurgle's ever-present sorcery, as they glowed with a sickly, lambent green warped energy, their surfaces now oozing with a gangrenous pus that never ended. The Death Guard had been reborn into real space, but they were no longer just Space Marines. No, they were Plague Marines, the very embodiment of decay and rebirth everlasting. They were no longer champions of the Emperor, but rather harbingers of pestilence, disease, and carriers of Nurgle's blight. Their transformation was not limited to the Death Guard alone, as Mortarion, the Primarch who had once led them through the fires of the Great Crusade, had been forever altered. He grew taller, more gaunt, as though he had been stretched upon a rack. His once immense form, honed and powerful, had now become sickly and skeletal, a hollow shell that reflected the very essence of death. His once pristine battle plate had become fused with his bloated and deformed body, as it was now an instrument of decay. In return for the deliverance of himself and his sons from the agonizing torment of the warp, Mortarion had traded his soul for a terrible fate, as he was reborn as Nurgle's greatest demonic servant, the Prince of Decay, Nurgle's very own demon Primarch. Mortarion was no longer the Primarch of the Death Guard. No, he was the very embodiment of death, a living image of Nurgle's will, doomed to exist in an ever-present state of eternal decay and rejuvenation. He was condemned to feel every plague he would ever spread, simultaneously healing from it and being infected once again, not only amongst his own legion, but throughout the galaxy, carrying with him disease and destruction of Nurgle's own twisted creation wherever he went, eternally cursed with unending pain and suffering. Every rasping breath of pain, every agonizing twist and popping boil, blistering flesh would be a torment unending that he would not only spread, but also suffer from. Prior to the official commencement of the four Chaos-aligned legions' official foray into the Siege of Terra, discussions circled upon how they would proceed and distribute their forces, and eventually would break down as follows. "Then I shall land first," said Angron enthusiastically. "I shall come at them and cleave their bodies." "You will not," said another, a familiar voice, a quiet, rasping, sullen growl, but changed, thickened with phlegm. "I claim the task." My legion will be the first to attack the walls, as I pledged to the War Master months ago. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, entered through the grand doors of Lubakal's court. This was not Mortarion as his brothers remembered him. He was changed, like Angron, Fulgrim, and Magnus, lifted by the Pantheon and given new form. Always amongst the tallest of the Primarchs, he had grown further, his famine-spare frame pushed to great height. Tattered moth wings furled on his back. The scythe silence had grown with its master, becoming as long as a Vox transmission pole. Mortarion appeared sickly, with his face scarred by disease, and his eyes milky with cataract. Fluid wept from the craters of his deadly armor, while all around him swirled a dense, stinking fog. Where he passed the door, Abaddon's Justerian fell. Black fluid leaked from perished seals, and bloody phlegm coughed from their breathing gills. The sounds of armor closing itself against the environment filled the room. The Terminators suffered in the grip of sickness. Mortarion continued forward, felling Horus's elite by his very presence. Back away from him, Abaddon commanded. Seal the room. Atmospheric cyclers ceased turning. Machines bleeped out tones of compliance. Still, the Lord of Death marched forward. Cribe began to cough behind his mask. Aximund took several steps back, his face greening as he fumbled on his helm. Lyric dropped to his knees, singing praise in ear-burning tongues of his worship, but he too struggled to breathe Mortarion's miasma. Of all of them, only Horus, Tormageddon, and Abaddon were left unaffected. A stench wreathed the Lord of Death that defied any kinds of description. Human sense lacked the capacity to experience its fullness. So foul, so pungent with rot and sickly life was it, that it triggered Abaddon's homeophagia as he tasted a banquet of mireless sublime in their variety. It shook him to his soul that he could breathe. He looked to the others, choking on Mortarion's forter, and yet when the Primarch approached Abaddon, he inhaled easily, though the stench appalled him. Mortarion stopped a few feet from his brother's throne. Pearlescent eyes stared down into brown, both afire with inner power that was not of the mortal realm. His breathing labored, rattling in his lungs. Amix and Cribe dragged themselves back behind the throne, crawling as far as they could from the corrupted Primarch. Retching grated from Cribe's vox emitter as he vomited into his helmet. Aximund pulled himself into a corner, managing to roll onto his back as he lay stupefied. The Lord of Death slammed the ferrule of silence upon the floor. "My War Master, I heed your call." With those words he knelt. The height his transformation had bestowed upon him meant that he was as tall as a seated War Master, even when he bowed. Abaddon suppressed a sneer. Such weakness. The Lord of Death traded his position as a Lord of Men to become a slave of the gods. Angron paced in and out of the field of view of his hollow emitter. Fulgrim giggled. Perturabo glared. "My brother, we welcome you," said Horus. "Rise." Bones popped as the Lord of Death stood again. "I come to fulfill my promise and lead the assault upon the palace." His voice, once a pure brass, was now a hoarse whisper. "You are greatly gifted by our patrons," Horus said, taking in his brother's form. "You will not be able to set foot upon Terra. I have patience. My sons will go before me and prepare the way. They are ready," said Mortarion. "We bring weapons for an old war. My warriors have transcended the limitations of mortality. Nothing can harm them. While I have 7 plagues for you to unleash upon Terra, let the unseen soldiers of Bellicus and Virus reap the foe and add their deaths to the total. And when the tally pleases Father Nurgle, then I shall descend upon the palace and take my vengeance upon the false emperor." Eventually, after having been on the battlefield for long enough, the Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars, found it prudent to specifically target Mortarion's sons, and it would go as follows. The Khan was alone, and the enemy saw immediately what prize was within their grasp. Hundreds of Mortarion's sons closed in from the fog, bolt guns blazing. His armor sparked with impacts. For a moment, it withstood the assault, but even his panoply was not immune to concentrated fire. The Warhawk lived by one rule of war above all others, one he learned the moment his adopted family were slaughtered by the Curides and born out in his war against the Palatine on Chagoris. Attack was the strongest form of defense. The Khan fought with a silent fury, charging into the ranks of the Death Guard, his talwar spinning in a blurring figure eight. He crashed into them without slowing, his sword cutting them down. Ceramite was atomized by the blade's disruption field. Viscera spilled onto the earth. Polluted blood showered him. Through his armor filters, he smelled the corruption upon Mortarion's sons. Theirs was a sickness of the flesh and soul. They fought slowly, without the finesseness of other legions, but the doggedness they were known for had been intensified by their fall into darkness. And no matter how many he killed, they persisted at him without cease. In the thick of them, he was safe from the firestorm they had unleashed. Hand-to-hand combat was on his terms, not theirs. The Death Guard favored disciplined lines and overwhelming close-range fire to bring down their enemies, taking whatever they received in return with grim stoicism. The Khan refused to allow them their preference, leaping amongst them, bearing down ranks before they formed. He fought unpredictably, throwing off the offensive of his foes, though he rushed them and pushed them back, or cut diagonally through their formation. Always the patterns of his movements took him closer to their defenses. If he was forced to take 50 steps away from the walls to throw them into disarray, he would take 51 back. His fury would have inspired thousands of bards, had any been able to see it. The fog made his fight a lonely struggle. Hidden from all knowledge, he faced the Death Guard alone, his Vox locator beacon jammed by haywire ordnance. The enemy died by the dozens, for not one was the match of a Primarch. But though he fought like a god of old, he was but one being against an army, and not even the sons of the Emperor were tireless or supplied with infinite battle fortune. The first cut to break through his armor came after his 14th kill. A son of Mortarion lunged at the back of his knee while he was engaging 4 to the front. The weapon he sought to slay a Primarch with was a simple combat knife, but perseverance pushed it through the armor ribbing of the joint seal. The Khan felt the blow as an angry hot sting, and the attacker paid for the injury with his life. The Khan smashed backwards with his talwar pommel, his emperor-given strength caving the ceramite, perished by rot and the greening head beneath. He bellowed in anger, slashing across at transhuman chest height to drive back the assailant to his front. 3 of them died in a storm of disruption lightning, their innards laid open to the chemical fog. A 4th lost his arm, and a 5th took a blow to the head that spun him around and knocked him down. The Khan would have finished him, but he was reaching instead for his damaged left knee, trying to pull out a knife lodged in his suit. At the first attempt, his fingers slipped through the blood-slicked hilt, made for hands smaller than his own. His second attempt was foiled by a renewed attack. The knife penetrated 7 centimeters into his flesh, no more interfering minimally with the bones of his joint. He had suffered far worse from deadlier weapons and fought on, trusting to his engineered physiology to blunt the pain. He pressed forwards, but as he did so, he felt the strength running from his body along with his unstaunched blood. Another Death Guard died, then another. Explosives were raining down on him now from the enemy side, seeking him out as the 14th Legion shelled their own troops in their lust to slay a Primarch. The Khan wondered if Mortarion saw his battle there, and grimly ordered his death, whatever the cost, to his son. There was a soulless pragmatism to the act, typical of the Lord of Death. The fog swirled with the rain of fire, lifting several of the horde of warriors in dirty white and green. A hotness spread from the piercing knife, infecting his blood with fever. Incredulous, the Khan fought still, but the touch of worry grazed his heart. Never in all his days had he been ill, but he instinctively recognized disease in him. He was human after all, on some distant level. His bones ached like ice. His flesh blazed, sweat dripped from his brow. He looked around at his brother's corrupted sons and wondered what an awful pact had been agreed to make them so, and give them the power to sicken a Primarch. "Mortarion, what have you done?" he shouted. There was no answer. His body raised with the infection of the knife. Well-being came and went as the knife's poison overcame each trick his engineered physiology deployed. He scrabbled for the knife again as he fought, his great tulwar burning through the air to obliterate yet more of the traitors, but he could not take enough time to pull the knife free. It was so firmly embedded and too delicate for his fingers to easily plug out. A surge of bile rose across his throat. As his limbs shook, he was slowing. The enemy were gathered closer, like the packs of hunters of ancient earth steppes, closing in on the great beast of those times. His next blow was weak enough to be turned aside. Arms clad in algae green gauntlets grappled with his forearm. With a bellow of anger, he wrenched himself free and stood for a moment unmolested before they surged forward, hacking and stabbing with more diseased weapons and dragging him down. The Khan of Khans ends his days, he thought, not upon a seat of grass in one final glorious charge, but dragged down and butchered in the mud. They wrestled with him, their filthy knives dragging grooves into his ceramite. They tried to get at the joints in his arms, groin, legs and neck, crawling on him like vermin. He threw them off once, twice, but the third time was an exhausted heave. His body burned with disease, and strength left him. A creature of unclean god. It was no longer the emperor's work. Brought forth a huge rusted axe for an executioner's stroke. I am Jagatai Khan, he shouted, the passion in his words driving them back. I am Jagatai Khan, loyal son of the emperor, and I have ridden well. As the Death Guard prepared to bear down and end the Khan, the great angel would descend upon them, saving his brother, and through their combined effort, cutting down the traitor forces of the Death Guard. However, the two Primarchs' actions were not enough to draw down the chaotic energies that were being created by the sons of Mortarion, and eventually, Mortarion would be able to manifest alongside his brother, Magnus the Red, who was more or less forced to work with Mortarion in order to carry out Perturabo's strategy for a proper siege of the Imperial Palace. And after having sent Isaac Araman ahead of him, Magnus finally arrives at the side of his now manifested on Earth brother in order to coordinate and carry out the Lord of Iron's orders. However, this would be one of the few times where disobeying the orders of Perturabo would actually be helpful in any way for the traitors, as it did manage to mend some ties between Mortarion and Magnus the Red, and it would go as follows. The air writhed open as motes of dust swirled, furled, and swam together, forming a great pointed archway that looked as though it had been fused from calcified bone. Cold light burned through the archway. Mortarion turned, raising his hand to shield his eyes against the glare. Araman bowed. The light shifting through the skeletal arch dimmed, sucking back like a tide to be absorbed into the figure that stepped out. The arch cooled, blistered, turned to virtuous stone, and then flickered and blew away into the air. The Crimson King arrived. Ermin could not look up upon him. His glory was too raw and bright. "You are late," said Mortarion. "My brother," said Magnus, his radiance dulled, just as he had chosen the magnificence of his arrival to establish unequivocal power. Now he selected his form carefully. A human face, one eye socket simply empty, a helm of wide, downturned ivory tusk to subliminally suggest difference, a modest scale, gigantic still, but deftly measured to be slightly shorter than the towering shape of the Lord of Death. Plain plate, even the billowing silk overrobe were demure and unpatterned to indicate submission. "I am glad to see you and stand with you," said Magnus. Mortarion glared. Araman rose again, watching and delighting in the Pale King's discomposure. "I," Mortarion began. "Be at ease," said Magnus. "Please, we are both under instruction from our brother, Perturabo. We are to abide by his plan. I would not have chosen to discomfort either of us by standing shoulder to shoulder with you. The Zone Imperialis is big, with many varied threats, but still, who am I to question the Lord of Iron's intricate scheme of war? The War Master has faith in his abilities," said Mortarion cautiously. "So do I, brother, so do I," said Magnus. "No finer exponent of siegecraft, so we are obliged." "It seems so," said Mortarion. Magnus nodded. "So, Colossi, your mighty strength and my qualities. I have no need of your qualities. I can crush this by myself. No doubt at all," said the Crimson King, "but I go where I am sent. You seem wary, brother. Surely our old disagreements are behind us. You bring that up, I read it in your face. And I have always read yours, Crimson King," said Mortarion. "Of your qualities, deceit has always been the uppermost." "There is no deceit today, brother," said Magnus. "That is why I came in person to assure you. We are as one we stand together. The Lord of Iron hath charged us with a task. We must be undivided. So let us take this moment to unburden ourselves of tiresome histories and reconcile. Things have changed. I say this of all this, so you must know I forgive you. You forgive me, Mortarion snarled. We are both now what you hated. It's unbearable, I know, the pain. The pain is nothing. The Pale King's voice was an empty husk. Magnus stepped closer to face him. The idea is not, he said as he looked Mortarion in the eyes. Your suffering gives you power, the sort I promised from the start. Your submission was not weakness. There is no shame. I bear you no ill will. I understand. It took the Pale King a moment to find his reply. I hate this, he whispered. I know, replied Magnus. It should ease your torment to know I harbor no resentment towards you, not now. Magnus placed a hand gently on Mortarion's shoulder. The Pale King flinched slightly, warily. What are you doing? He growled. I have had my gift for a lot longer than you have, said Magnus calmly. Let me show you how they may be harnessed. A golden light seeped from Magnus's fingers and suffused Mortarion's ragged palate. Mortarion blinked, straightened slightly, and took a breath. He seemed taller, less bowed in pain and wrath. His eyes had become fierce and unclouded. You are kind to me, he murmured, puzzled. There is only one enemy now, said Magnus, the Lie Father. We face him side by side. The Pale King nodded as he clutched his fellow king's hand for a second, then turned away to look upon his scythe and stepped over the ragged battlement. They watched his giant figure bounding effortlessly from block to block, descending the slope of the rubble and calling for his captain. Compassion? Asked Ahriman. A temporary respite, Magnus replied. He is made to endure more than any of us, but pain dulled his abilities. He must learn to love what he is, or he will be of no use. And he and his legion are fine blunt instruments to crack the wall, to open the way, to let me reach the place I need to be. Eventually, the Khan and Mortarion would face each other once again. Mortarion, with his new craven god-given gift and rejuvenated by Magnus, felt much more in control and believed he'd be able to take out the Khan. As Mortarion dismissed the White Scars as simple barbarians for him to swat aside and to be able to take over the Lionsgate spaceport. It was a mistake to think back, of course, because both of them had changed so much. The Lord of Death had burst free from his old bounds, becoming grotesque and monstrous. He wore a human form only in outline. Now his skinny body, inhabited by a ramshackle armor of corrosion and decay, a gaggle of loosely held panels, and moldy fabric, seemingly liable to fall apart at any moment. The air around him was acid, suffered with a foulness that turned the stomach and made it hard to breathe. He was ruined and yet exalted, crippled and yet stronger than he had ever been. So the old encounter meant little. Then it had been a matter of speed against interactability, and either approach could have emerged victorious. Now though, the parameters had changed. Mortarion's brute strength had grown obscenely. The warp coursed thickly through his veins, pulsing under heavily mutated skin. Whenever he moved, reality flexed around him, recoiling at the violation of natural law. His great blade displayed reflections of the hell realm beyond. Its rotting gardens, its tormented flesh, its fertile pain field. What did he, the Khan, have to set against all that? The old prowess with a blade, some fine armor, the residue of that famed quickness? Not enough. He had his hatred, though. That was different from before. On Prospero, the discord between them had been regretful as much as anything. Both of them disappointed at what was being thrown away by the other. Now his hatred was as infinite as the void. Too many had died at Kalthos for it to be any other way. His warriors, his ship, his counselor, all swallowed up by the monster before him, all owing their death to the single soul. The Khan had that. He had his rage, deep as the world's core, fueling every strike and sweep of the great Tao blade. He had the keen edge of vengeance to propel his limbs, to find a chink that could wound his horrific amalgam of posthuman and yaksha, to keep going against the impossible. They crashed together, then cracking the stone underfoot as they braced against it, the white tiger snarled itself on silence, releasing an explosion of mangled forces as they both pushed against the other, testing strength and poise, feeling the the harmonics in their weapons and gauging what it meant for the strength of their bearers. Khan fell back first. They exchanged more rapid, heavier, faster. Around them, the roar of broader combat filtered up from the decks below, a chorus of screams and explosions that could not be filtered out. Their strikes accelerated, ramping up swiftly until the blows were exceptional in their heft and precision. Mortarion had sped up, his old solidity replaced by a phase-shifting demonic velocity, whilst arcs of his scythe hissed with unearthly voices, wounding the atmosphere itself. When the warp-forged steel connected, the impact was bone-breaking, mind-jarring, a collision of dimensions as much as solid matter. I expected you to dance, the Death Lord grunted, hammering the Khan back further. Lost your footing as well as your judgment? The Khan was already breathing heavily. The going was hard as expected, harder maybe. There had never been any illusions. He worked his blade rapidly, its edge losing definition as the point whirled faster than thought. The scythe met it in an explosion of plasma and ceramite shards, swinging heavily, cracking with a hiss of imperfections of its half-formed demonic choir. You are already defeated, the Khan told him. You have become what you hated. Mortarion snorted. Some hatreds were never worth pursuing. Tell yourself that if it helped. The acceleration continued. The blows became denser than true mortal frames could ever have propelled. The combatants smashed in close, then reeled away into one of the gallery columns. The masonry cracked apart, driven into disintegrating dust clouds as the Primarchs crunched their way clean through it. The Khan's armor took the first transverse slash, ripping the finery from the shoulder to the waist. Blood followed the path of the strike, splattering against the deck. They were alone now. They had entered the world of exclusivity, a level of combat no other being, Xenos or human, could hope to match, just to witness. To try and follow it was to invite a kind of madness. The Primarchs kept themselves tightly under control, almost all the time wearing the trappings of mortality over their true natures. When they cast that off, they unlocked their inner selves. The result was difficult to watch, let alone intervene in. Time has been cruel, Jagatai, Mortarion said, still calm, still fighting within himself, cracking the Khan away yet again, smacking the gold chasing from his helm, and rocking his head back. You are not what you were. I am what I always was, the Khan snarled, driving back expertly against the flurry of heinously perfect blows, and raking plague centers free of their chains. Weak, loyal, same thing. The two of them barreled into the galley's external walls, hammering one another so fiercely that the entire section collapsed as if torpedoed. They swirled and dueled through the tumbling rubble, then into the exposed night air, completely absorbed now in their own private contest. The rest of the planet, the rest of existence, might as well have slipped away, shamefaced at the volume of physical brutality unleashed upon its surface. But that violence only ratcheted up, every second taking over. More. Mortarion nearly took the Khan's head clean off with a vicious diagonal swipe. Silence's curved tip carved a 3-foot deep trench into the deck. When pulled out again, it ripped up whole clumps of static wreathed rockcrete. The Khan shouldered through the barrage to land a spiteful cut on the Death Lord's leading thigh, stripping the pox-riddled armor clean from the flesh and taking his first blood before being hammered back. They were out in the open then, lashing swings across one of the big landing stages, a kilometer across and 1,200 meters up. Above them, the storm raged, coursing through the green lightning that snapped down the high reaches of the spaceport. Below them, the bulk of the immense fortress spread out in a panoply of jumbled stages and terraces. Each inch of it was fought over now, a million points of light exposing white guards and death guard. It was as if the entire battle had found its apex, its distilled expression, so that all those thousands and thousands of individual duels created their gestalt combination at the summit of the decaying pile. This isn't about revenge for me, said Mortarion, his rasping voice still contained. You're just in the way now. You understand that. The Khan laughed bloodily, spitting out shattered teeth. Now that I see it, brother, he hissed, I'm here for you, nothing else. Mortarion backhanded him, cracking a savage hit into the Khan's throat before following up with a two-handed down thrust of the scythe. Indulgent, but then you always were. Another smack against the helm, a discharge of virulent nerve gas. Bit at the edge, the destruction of the Khan's pauldron, making him stagger. I led my legion as I saw fit, the Khan snarled. You might have tried the same. The white tiger flashed, going for the jingling cables at Mortarion's neck, but it was swatted aside. I led the death guard before you were even found. The Khan held his ground against the onslaught, muscles screaming as they propelled his blade into dazzling arc. Sweat poured across his burning skin, mingling with blood now. Not sure your first captain would agree. That unleashed the flood. Mortarion roared back at him, his gossamer wings rearing up as his mighty arms flailed. Furious and devastating, he crunched and bludgeoned the Khan out across the face of the landing, writhing him in plumes of poison, smashing his metal gauntlet, cracking his flanks with the shaft of his ether-snarled scythe before plunging the curved edge back around and up into his torso. To endure all that, to not be completely swept away and broken into 1,000 pieces, took every scrap of skill and tenacity the Khan still possessed. By this point, he was fighting beyond anything he had ever achieved before, subverting the boundaries of the possible and digging into the impossible, and he was still being battered, bruised, hammered, and driven across the storm-wrecked port edge. At this point, his right arm was fractured, his flank was lacerated, and his cheeks were shattered. Silence hung around him like the wheeling stars, its length cracking with vicious energies, both faster than the warp snarl and heavier than a star's heart. You know nothing, Mortarion snarled, rearing up, his cloak whipping about him. Nothing of sacrifice, nothing of denial. You were a spoiled child, whining about your need for structure as the rest of us built an empire. Mortarion's eyes flared with a maddened green tinge, his visible face twisted into true rage. He was an elemental, he was apocalyptic, he was phenomenal. The tempest shrieked around him that amplified every killing strike, tearing up ground as he scoured across, sending the remnants of the landing blasting towards the Khan and his retreating form. You were shown the nature of the galaxy, and you turned away. Mortarion raged, slamming his scythe down, breaking the Khan's trailing leg in two. I embraced it. I embraced the pain. I looked the god in the eye. It ends here, Mortarion said, his face a rictus of anger. The Khan chuckled painfully under his lensless helm. I see, but I'm laughing now, brother, he rasped, the thick blood in his throat making his words gurgle. You should start to worry. The fight would continue and their clashes would intensify. Mortarion would snarl as he worked his scythe harder again, feeling his fatigue and muscles scream even as his mind reeled from the realization. As the Khan had started to dance, not with any beauty, that had been ripped away from him, but still with an unearthly slipperiness, that mesmerizing power appearing to be in one place, inviting the strike, only to be a hand's width away, just enough to drop under your guard and slice a piece of you away. He could still do it when we do this with our ships, the Khan growled, no longer laughing, now deadly serious. We call it Zhao, the Chisi. Their blades clash again in an exploration of mangled warp detonations. The two of them both reeled away from the blow, barely able to keep their feet. He was damaged. He had hurt him, and the Khan came back quicker, his smashed ankles somehow propelling him across the erupted ground faster than Mortarion could react. When the Dao clanged against the scythe again, the blood splattered freely, but it was no longer just Jagatai. Mortarion swiveled on his heel as he smashed away the Khan. That sent the Primarch tumbling, but he came straight back again, lurching from his catastrophic injuries as if drunk, his devastated face etched with exertion, but he was still fighting through it, through all the forceful tolls of damage. It was as if some malevolent spirit had now animated him, pushing his ravaged body onwards until it achieved the absolution it needed. The sword spun faster, blurring across Mortarion's doubled vision, getting difficult to stop. The two of them traded earth-breaking blows, tearing more of their priceless battle plates, smashing files and rupturing cables, severing chains lengths as their cloaks were ripped to shreds and their finery destroyed, their raw selves exposed in blood and modded canvases of skin-stripped muscle. Their previous selves returned back to the primal truth. They were savage weapons, the numbered blades of an unwilling god. Mortarion was still the greater of them. He was still stronger, more steeped in the preternatural gift, but now all that he felt was doubt, rocked by the remorseless fury of one who had never been anything more than flighty, self-righteous, and unreadable. All Mortarion could see then was one who wished to kill him, who would do anything, sacrifice anything, fight himself beyond physical limits, destroy his own body, his own heart, his own soul, just for the satisfaction of the oaths he made into the void. If you know what I did, Mortarion cried out, fighting on now through the cold fog of indecision, then you know the truth, brother. I can no longer die. It was as if a final signal had been given. The Khan's bloodied head lifted, and the remains of his long hair hanging in matted clumps. Oh, "Oh, I know that," he murmured, with the most perfect contempt he had ever mustered, "but I can." Then he leapt. His broken leg still propelled him. His fractured arms still bore his blade. His blood-filled lungs and perforated heart still gave him enough power, and he swept in close. If he had been at the prime of condition, the move might have been hard to counter, but he was already held together by a force of will, and so silence interposed itself, catching the Khan and impaling him deep. But that didn't stop him. The parry had been seen, planned for, and so he just kept coming, digging himself up through the length of the blade until a scythe jutted out from his ruptured back, and the white tiger was tight against Mortarion's neck. For an instant, their two faces were right up against one another. Both cadaverous now, drained of blood, drained of life, existing only as masks of pure vengeance, all of their majesty stripped away, scrapped out across utilitarian rockcrete, leaving just desire, the violence of the brute mechanisms of desperate struggles. It only took a split second for Mortarion's eyes to widen, realizing that he could no longer wrench his brother away in time. As the Khan's eyes narrowed, that makes the difference, severing Mortarion's neck cleanly in an explosion of black bile before collapsing into his own warp explosion that turned the landing stage briefly into the brightest object on the planet after the Emperor's tormented soul itself. Shortly after this, the Khan would be retrieved, his near-death state pushing his sons into a righteous frenzy that overwhelmed, at least temporarily, the sons of the now slain Mortarion. Eventually, they would attack the Lion's Gate spaceport once again, but by then, the White Scars had retreated, with their Primarch in tow, and the defense was largely taken up by the Dark Angels under the command of Cypher. And eventually, this second push would be overwhelmed once more by the Loyalist forces, reigniting the Astronomicon through faith, pushing back the Sons of Mortarion, leading to their end in the participations of the Siege of Terra. Though the Siege of Terra ultimately ended up in the Emperor's victory and the tragic fall of Horus Lupercal, the fate of the Death Guard would not follow the same path as the other traitor legions. The Death Guard, under their command of their now demonic Primarch Mortarion, did not flee in disarray into the Eye of Terror as their fellow legions had. Rather, they made an orderly withdrawal, one marked by an unwavering uniformity. As the forces of the Imperium pressed forward, driven by the Emperor's wrath, Mortarion and his Death Guard would have their forces broken upon the Emperor's lines, their bodies essentially lost to the weapons that the remaining loyalists now had, as they wreaked a glorious vengeance upon the traitors. Upon reaching the Eye of Terror, Mortarion claimed his new dominion, a demon world known as the Plague Planet. This world was a toxic, festering wasteland. Ironically enough, it was a perfect place for Mortarion to shape into a reflection of his own new nature, one of disease, decay, and unrelenting horror, and it would become his home, a place from where to launch his unholy campaigns into the material universe from. It was not long before Nurgle, the Plague God, recognized Mortarion's accomplishments and promoted him to the rank of the greatest of his demon princes. Mortarion had at last achieved what he had long desired, a world of his own. Yet it was not a world of proud and pristine consequence that he had once sought, but a corrupted, agonizing land of suffering and decay. In this dark reflection of his new existence, Mortarion had come to rule, as a lord of rot and the sovereign of the Plague Planet. For Mortarion's sons, the Death Guard, their new existence was marked by a wide range of responses to their transformations and to their overall loss during the Siege of Terra. Some found themselves to fully embrace the blessings of Nurgle, celebrating their new forms, convinced in their arrogance that they had been chosen as the most worthy to receive Nurgle's favor. They believed, having passed through the eye of the needle of this transformation, they had proven themselves not just worthy of their new master, but uniquely superior to all other mortals, including those of the other God-aligned forces. These warriors reveled in their new power granted to them by the Plague Lord, their hearts hardened against every notion of weakness, as they saw themselves as truly eternal, beyond the touch of normal decay, sustained by the very will of their new god, Grandfather Nurgle. Others, however, found their new existences far less satisfying. These warriors could not forget that the plague had laid them low, and in their minds, this transformation signified a weakness they could never accept. To them, Nurgle's blessings were no gift that must be repaid with destruction. They sought not only to embrace their new forms, but to spread the plague across the galaxy and bring the entire universe down to their level. For these warriors, there was no peace in their condition, only madness in the relentless ruin they would bring. Then there were those who had been driven to true madness in the depths of suffering. These individuals exhibited twisted behaviors, sometimes indulging in gleeful rambunctiousness, other times sinking into an ever-present melancholy. In the end, Mortarion's legion had become what they had long since accepted: chained servants of Nurgle, body and soul bound in eternal servitude to the Plague God. Though their forms had been changed, their fates had been sealed, as they would remain devoted to Nurgle's insidious will. And as the millennia passed, this devotion would only grow stronger. With each passing century, their connection to their deity deepened, and their desire to spread decay across the galaxy only intensified. As the Death Guards, once champions of the Emperor, had now become true instruments of rot, destruction, and endless pestilence. Mortarion had finally found his home, and so had his legion, but rather one where they were embraced and their ideologies remained firm. They were bowed, as this was a home of corruption, decay, and an eternal war as the Plague God's servant, who would carry forth the will of their Dark Lord, sowing pestilence, despair, and death across the galaxy until the Imperium would fall, or until all life in existence was consumed by the rot of their plague. The Death Guard's legacy was one of decay, and there would be no redemption for them, no salvation, only Nurgle's foul blessings for eternity. Even today, in the 41st millennium, Mortarion's grip over the Death Guard remains absolute. His existence continues as a shadow over the galaxy, a perpetual reminder of the consequences of the heresy. Mortarion, the Prince of Decay, still lingers, as his powers were undiminished by the passage of millennia. And recently, Mortarion has reemerged into real space for the first time since the fall of Horus. He has led the Death Guard in what became known as the Plague Wars, targeting the realm of Ultramar during the Era Indomitus, a time where the galaxy was torn asunder once more. Here the Death Guard launched their assault from the Cadian Gate, their influence spreading beyond the veil of the eye into the wider galaxy, and the Death Guard are now relentless in their mission to spread the terrible blessings of Grandfather Nurgle, their malevolent patron. Wherever their forces travel, they bring with them joyful, exuberant gift of the Plague God, infecting their enemies with plagues and offering them an eternal life twisted by the diseases ridden into them by the will of Nurgle. Each pestilence they carry further deepens their devotion to their master, as their wars against the Imperium rage on. Meanwhile, Typhon, once merely a servant of Mortarion, has taken up a new role. Now known as Typhus the Traveler, he forsook his master's direct command and struck out on his own to spread the pestilence of Nurgle far and wide. Typhus became a terror in his own right, acting as an agent of corruption, delivering the Plague God's gift to the Emperor's followers. His campaigns grew more and more daring and destructive over time, especially during the 13th Black Crusade, where he secured a plague-ridden stronghold, cementing his status as a feared Lord of Chaos. The Death Guard, now under both Mortarion's leadership and Typhus's independent effort, have not simply survived the passage of time. They have flourished in their malevolent purpose, Mortarion forever bound to the will of Nurgle and Typhus, now an even greater threat, continue to spread ruination wherever they go. Their devotion to decay, disease, and the worship of the Plague God has only deepened with the passing of the ages. As the Death Guard's influence continues to spread, one must ask, can the Imperium ever fully stop the forces of Nurgle? Is there any true hope of curbing the decay Mortarion and Typhus have unleashed? With the Plague Wars still ongoing and remain a consistent, corrupting presence upon the galaxy, their victories in the heresy only being the beginning of a war waged for a lifetime. The Plague Wars stand as one of the most horrific and insidious campaigns ever waged by the forces of chaos, led by the demon Primarch Mortarion and his Death Guard, the once proud champions of the Imperium. This war was an effort to expand the influence of the Chaos God Nurgle, the Plague God, into the very heart of the Imperium's most outstanding stronghold. Their target was the realm of Ultramar, the home of the esteemed Ultramarines and the legacy of Roboute Guilliman. This was a bastion and a key position of power for the Imperium. The Plague Wars began in the aftermath of the Great Rift tearing open the skies, that vast tear within reality that split the galaxy asunder and ushered in the era known as Noctis Aeterna, a time of nigh perpetual darkness. While the precise beginning of this conflict remains mostly lost to history and covered in a mortuary shroud of uncertainty, the war itself can be traced back to the opening salvos of the 41st millennium, and it stretched undeterred by the Imperium's many struggles, to the point that by the end of 111 M42, the war had not only ravaged Ultramar, but it had spread its pestilent influence across countless star systems. The origins of the Plague Wars are often debated. Some claim that the first hostilities took place just prior to the opening of the Great Rift, suggesting that Nurgle's minions had been preparing for this campaign for centuries. What is clear, however, is that the Plague Wars spanned an incredibly wide area of the galaxy, with its most concentrated battles taking place within the realm of Ultramar, the home of the Ultramarines. The deathless forces of Nurgle, led by Mortarion, came in unending waves, each more terrifying than the last, as they swept across the star systems of Ultramar. And their forces were bolstered by the uncountable hordes of plague demons, chaos cultists, and traitor Astartes alike. Amongst the diseases unleashed, these maladies spread with such a virulent ease that entire worlds fell to them, and their populations reduced to swarming disease husks of what they once were. The population of these once thriving systems now faced a grim fate: succumb to the pox or become twisted abominations and vessels for Nurgle's eternal gift. As the diseases ran rampant across the galaxy, they overwhelmed Imperial defense lines. The Imperium's forces, though formidable, were ill prepared for the relentless assault, and the Death Guard, transformed into Plague Marines, took the brunt offensive. Their tenacity, strengthened further by the gifts of Nurgle and the aeons spent wallowing within the warp-rich energies of the Plague Planet, allowed them to continue to push deeper and deeper still into Imperial space, undeterred by the stalwart and ever-present resistance from the Ultramarines. Though the Plague Wars have seen moments of relative dormancy, the forces of chaos retreating or regrouping, it has never truly ceased. These intervals of intermittent quiet were merely the calm before another eruption of pestilence and plague, during the times the warriors of the Imperium believed victory was within their grasp. Nurgle's forces would rise once more, overwhelming them with a renewed vigor. The Plague Wars, as they are understood by the Imperium, remain a conflict without clear boundaries. There's not simply cordoned off lines of conflict confined to Ultramar, but it also stretches northward into an area known as the Scourge Stars, a region of space once prosperous with worlds now being consumed by the pervasive spread of Nurgle's diseases. As the plague god's corruption spreads further, entire systems become engulfed in sickness and in unending despair. It is here that the forces of chaos under Mortarion's command have made a mark, and the Imperium remains locked in an ongoing, unending battle against Nurgle's forces. The Indominus Crusade under Roboute Guilliman would eventually come to stymie the unceasing threat of Mortarion's legion, as Mortarion's already large invasion force had been bolstered by mutant cultists and warriors from the Scourge Stars. He was also at this point accompanied by Typhus' plague fleet and a great unclean one named Kugroth, who led a host of 7 greater demons of Nurgle called the Plague Guard. Their strategy was centered around holding a few major planets, including Esplendor and Connor, while launching raiding attacks and seeding nearby systems with further poxes and diseases. Mortarion's partial conquest of the Esplendor system opened up the gateway for a direct invasion fleet to surge into Ultramar proper. The planets of Iax were overrun by Nurgle demons rather quickly, allowing the bulk of their invasion force to be bared upon the Ultramarines. This would be their base of operations and the point of attack for the entirety of their invasion of Ultramar proper. Mortarion, his Death Guard, and the rest of the Plague Guard would gather at this point before moving forward, as Macragge would suffer collisions with chaos-induced unrest, as Mortarion sent probing attacks to the Ultramarines' homeworld, both of Space Marines and from cultists. While they were not able to spread large amounts of destruction through these tactics, they drew out more and more of Marneus Calgar's defense forces away from the planet's actual defense and had them redistributed in peacekeeping missions. This would allow Typhus, along with his own plague fleet, to overrun at least one or more of Ultramar's star force before attacking a Ultramarine stronghold on the world of Barimo. However, hearing of his power base coming under attack, Guilliman eventually returned to Ultramar away from his Indominus Crusade, bringing with him thousands upon thousands of Primaris reinforcements. First, he directed his men to cleanse the hive world of Ardium in the Macragge system from every last shred of the Death Guard. There, he discovered Mortarion was using the Hand of Darkness to craft new plague engines, all the while reanimating the dead and using them as a plague of undead horrors. And he would quickly put a stop to this and stymie the Nurglite influence within the area. He then quickly headed over to Macragge and offloaded thousands of Primaris Marine reinforcements, along with other allies, including uncountable numbers of Astra Militarum and Navis Imperialis troops. He would then go on to organize the Ultramarines to launch a large-scale counterattack against the invaders, as he also drew upon several Ultramarine successors, their fleets engaging the Death Guard in near legion numbers, and doing their best to successfully keep Ultramar's shipping lanes safe, for it was through logistics that the Ultramarines would be able to outdo the Death Guard. Guilliman quickly set his eyes on retaking the Splendor system, which would essentially cordon off Mortarion and cut off the Death Guard's primary supply line. He would go on to retake each and every world, systematically destroying the engines that were created to plague zombies and other munitions, freeing the entire planets from the influence of chaos in short order, destroying all the zombies upon these planets and their sources in quick but rather decisive battles. Guilliman would then give a true death to one of Nurgle's greater demons, Cormac, using the Emperor's sword, destroying him permanently despite his god's best efforts to avoid so, as at this point Guilliman was wielding one of the few weapons in existence who could give a demon a true death. With their supply lines to the Scourge Stars cut and their plague engines utterly destroyed, along with further Imperial reinforcements pouring into Ultramar with each passing day, Mortarion found himself on the back foot. This was a war of attrition, and unfortunately Guilliman had the better supply line, so despite his own men's resilience, Mortarion was forced to back off. But rather than doing the logical thing, backing off, regrouping before launching another assault, Mortarion decided to throw all his remaining forces at one target. Since Macragge was still too heavily defended, the forces of Nurgle decided to assault a different target, the Ultramarines world of Parmino, and this would see the biggest clash between the traitors and the loyalists, as the Ultramarines would use their largest star fort, Galatan, to provide as much support as possible in engaging the Plague Fleet, as they also bombarded the Traitor Marines with everything they had. However, this was not without a price. The chapter master of the Nova Marines would pass on, allowing Guilliman and the Ultramarines to slowly whittle down their opponent. Guilliman killed another one of Nurgle's greater demons and shattered the Plague Guard, giving the loyalists the upper hand to make gains. Eventually, there would be a direct confrontation, and Mortarion and Guilliman would fight. Herein, Mortarion would inject Guilliman with a disease known as the God Blight, what is believed to be Nurgle's most potent disease ever, essentially winning the fight. However, things would change swiftly as the tides of the Empyrean shifted away from the favor of the Plague God. The moment fled back into the past where it belonged. Guilliman's body slammed into wet soil. He was dying again. His soul clung on, but it too was being eaten alive by Mortarion's plague. Footsteps halted by his head. There was a poke at his breastplate upon the armor of fate. Guilliman then heard Mortarion speak, but he could not see, and he could not sense anything other than pain. "Do you seek Guilliman? You followed the wrong master," said Mortarion. "He is a cyst, pus-filled canker surrounding a dead thing lodged in the fabric of reality. Like a thorn or a piece of shrapnel, it must be drawn out for things to heal. Do you understand now? This is what you follow?" Mortarion grunted in amusement. "Of course you can't answer. I doubt you could understand anyway." There was a sound of Mortarion's shifting stance as a wistful tone entered his voice. "We will soon be in the Garden of Nurgle, my brother. The veils are parting. I can see it already. Once you are dead, this world will fall with it and become a jewel of decay. You have damaged my network, but not by enough. And at the coming of your death, one by one, each of your worlds will pass from this place of cold void, uncaring stars, into the Grandfather's embrace. I wish you could see it. It is beautiful, full of life and potential. There are trees there, and plants of amazing variety. It is not barren. It is not like that cold light you showed me. Not like him. It is not like the Materium at all, with its pointless struggle against inevitability. Here, nothing truly ever ends, but it is reborn and dies, and is reborn and dies, over and over again. Everything here is given many gifts. Nothing, no matter how small, is overlooked, and all share in the Grandfather's bounties. There is no pain, because there is no pain. Suffering is born gladly. Now tell me, brother, compared to that hell our father inflicted upon the galaxy, does that sound terrible?" "I wish you could see it," he said. The pain still raged through Guilliman, but it was diminishing. "If only you would turn. You are nearly dead. Soon the pain will be over." Mortarion knelt beside his brother and rested a hand on his chest. "Don't you want that for it to be done?" He began to stroke, like he was soothing a feverish child. "Hush now, Roboute. Hush. Go to the Grandfather, and you will see. He will make all things right. He will take the pain away forever." The garden shook with an earthquake. Strange demonic creatures that dwelled there set up a cacophony of cries and moans. On the areas of lax it overlaid, reality trembled as it reasserted itself, and the garden began to fade. "Impossible," Mortarion whispered. The corpse of his brother twitched. The armor of fate was a corroded shell, but somehow its power pack restarted as lights blinked on the systems all over it. Guilliman's blackened face turned up to look at him. Mortarion felt something huge and dangerous moving through the warp, something he had not felt in a long time. Guilliman's back arched. The armor was humming now, giving off a psychic signature of arcane mechanisms. The earth would shake once again. A second toll of an unseen bell sent the denizens of the garden into an uncontrollable frenzied panic. Trees cracked as they dragged up roots and attempted to lumber away. A million kinds of demon fly buzzed up from the corpse grounds and flew away in gathering swarms. Nurglings shrieked and waddled as fast as they could, and Mortarions raising silence in an attempt to bring it down as fast as possible to destroy Guilliman and finally take his soul as a sacrifice to the greater god Nurgle, even if it could not take his words. But he could no longer move, as Guilliman's eyes were glowing with a pure power. The last slimes of his decayed flesh burned away, and a network of feathery capillaries spread in their place, bringing in new blood unsullied by the god blight. The metal of the armor of fate shimmered, impossibly remaking itself. Bright decorations appeared as tarnished and cracked armor fell away. Wires grew anew and reconnected as surely as Guilliman's skin was growing back. The never ground of the garden shook hard as the demons, large and small, were screaming and scurrying away, emerging from their hiding places and fleeing in a raucous stampede. The ground would finally break as Guilliman's corpse fully rose and spoke. "He speaks through me, brother. Does he not speak to you?" The now godly, undeniable radiance of Guilliman caused Mortarion to have to lift his hands to protect his eyes as he asked, "Father," in a tone mirroring that of a young child, discovering that his father knew he had done something wrong. "I am his right hand, brother," Guilliman spoke. "I am his general, his champion, his avenging son. By his might am I preserved." The landscape flickered between the blasted battlefield of Yak and Nurgle's garden, as the ground of the garden was rolling, giving away under the power. "This is impossible, you should be dead," Mortarion screamed, a panic coursing through his very body. "You are a traitor," Guilliman's voice spoke, but it was not quite his. "You have brought low all that could have been, but you are as much a victim as a monster, Mortarion. Perhaps one day you might be saved. Until then, you must go to the master you chose." "No," Mortarion cried, but it was too late. Some force reached for him and yanked him back as he flew back over and over through the gardens towards the black house of the Plague God. He felt a moment of perfect terror before he flew through the open portal and it slammed shut behind him, trapping him altogether with a more powerful god. Nurgle was displeased as Guilliman looked over the garden. He was now between worlds. The warp was shifting, constantly changing, never consistent. The garden was a collection of ideas as it had no true form, though it was a sea of a million other worlds which underpinned it. The dreams of the souls living and dead, and past that, still, as if glimpsed through the blinks of a glittering sea mist, evaporated before the morning sun. "Hear me," Guilliman's voice boomed, his father's blazing sword burning brighter than it ever had before, as it threatened to burn out reality around it. "I am Roboute Guilliman, the last loyal son of the Emperor of Terra. It is not your destiny to end today, God of Plague, but know that I am coming for you, and I will find you, and I will burn you." He gripped the sword of the Emperor in a two-handed grip, raising it high as waves of fire ripped into the garden. From the burning inferno, a mass of screams came, as a flame hotter than a million suns, burning a million times for a million years, erased everything from its path, finally breaking and receding just yards away from the black walls of home, his stronghold, as its infinite halls shook and mossy tiles fell from its roof. Sodden timbers steamed as parts of Nurgle's garden were permanently burned away. "I speak for the Emperor of Mankind." Then Guilliman fell, and he fell and fell back into reality. The sword of the Emperor would be buried point down into the cracked earth, as its fires turned everything to the ground below him to glass, as burnt out suits of armor from the Death Guard were littered around him. Only he was unscathed. Mortarion no longer to be seen, and he stood. Whatever presence that had previously inhabited and empowered him was now gone. The air was clean, and there was no sign of taint nearby. And he knew that the Emperor's sword had burned not only the god blood away, but permanently erased many a Death Guard and uncountable scores of demons from reality, permanently erasing them from existence. Roboute Guilliman would tell Maldor Cloquin, "It is done. Mortarion is gone. His network is broken, and the Plague Wars are over." He would then proceed to sheath the Emperor's sword and teleport away. With Mortarion's defeat, Roboute Guilliman seized the opportunity to stabilize the Imperium's defenses, overseeing the rebuilding of the realm of Ultramar, and instituting decontamination efforts across the systems that had previously been infected by the Death Guard. Under Guilliman's command, humanity began rebuilding in these sectors, their forces preparing for the next phases of the war. They understood that while the Plague Wars may be over, the conflict against the Death Guard was far from it, even as Guilliman directed Imperial efforts to recover from the plague-infested onslaughts. New Imperial crusades demanded his presence elsewhere, pulling him back into the wider galaxy, leaving the Ultramarines to continue the long process of recovery. But for this moment, respite would not last long, as, much like Nurgle's plagues, the Death Guard's cycles of war are eternal. Yet the Ultramarines had been hardened by the Plague Wars and began preparing for the inevitable return of Nurgle's servants. Though the Death Guard was thought to be temporarily beaten back, they had left their mark, and some of their forces had moved to incursions upon Imperium Nihilus. Yet they would not be forgotten. As the Imperium fortified its borders with new war machines, the forces of the Dark Gods still lurked within the shadows, waiting, ever patiently, for the right moment to strike, as this was a war of attrition, and this was a war that the Death Guard was more than prepared to fight.